For nearly 600 years, one family stood at the center of European power. Kings feared them, empires challenged them, and history itself seemed to bend in their favor. But behind the crowns, the palaces, and the glory was a hidden story filled with impossible choices, shocking betrayals, and one decision that changed the fate of an entire continent forever. So how did the most powerful dynasty in Europe lose everything? Let's uncover the incredible rise and tragic fall of the House of Habsburg, a dynasty based on inheritance needed documents almost as much as children. When lawyers argued over a province, they searched for old charters. When Rudolf forged the Privilegium Maius, he exploited documentary culture. When Charles VI promoted the Pragmatic Sanction, he sought signatures, ratifications, and international recognition. When Maria Theresa's enemies invaded, their armies proved that documents without force were fragile. Yet after wars ended, diplomats returned to paper. European order was repeatedly destroyed by cannon and reconstructed by clauses. The Habsburgs' relationship with law was therefore double. They treated law as sacred when it supported their claims and flexible when survival demanded invention. Their subjects behaved similarly. Hungarian nobles cited the Golden Bull of 1222 and historic constitutional rights. Bohemian estates defended election and religious privileges. Dutch provinces invoked charters against Spanish centralization. National movements later rediscovered medieval crowns and languages as evidence of ancient sovereignty. History became an arsenal from which every side selected weapons. The dynasty's enemies helped create its identity. French kings feared encirclement and described Habsburg universal monarchy as a threat to European liberty. Protestant writers portrayed Spain as cruel, fanatical, and tyrannical, contributing to the so-called Black Legend. Some accusations reflected real violence in the Netherlands and Americas. Others were wartime propaganda that ignored similar abuses by rival powers. Habsburg writers answered with images of Catholic defense, lawful inheritance, and providential mission. Modern historical understanding must pass between propaganda traditions without pretending neutrality means moral indifference. The Ottoman rivalry produced another vast memory. Christian chronicles celebrated sieges and victories. Ottoman sources recorded their own strategies and legitimacy. Border communities experienced the conflict less as a simple clash of civilizations than as cycles of taxation, raiding, trade, migration, and military employment. Captives crossed in both directions. Diplomats exchanged gifts. Merchants continued business during periods of peace. Architectural, musical, culinary, and linguistic influences moved across the frontier, even while rulers preached opposition. Vienna's victory in 1683 became central to later European nationalism. Paintings showed Sobieski, crosses, cavalry, and fleeing Ottomans. In reality, the relief depended on a coalition of Polish, Imperial, Bavarian, Saxon, and other forces. Habsburg commanders then built power in Hungary through decades of campaigning. The victory was not a final expulsion of Muslim presence from Europe, nor was it achieved by one nation. Simplified memory converted coalition warfare into a civilizational legend useful to later politics. The Habsburg monarchy's Jewish history was equally resistant to simple judgment. Medieval rulers expelled Jewish communities at times and protected them at others, often according to financial need, religious pressure, and local conflict. Court Jews such as Samuel Oppenheimer and Samson Wertheimer financed war and supplied armies, gaining influence while remaining vulnerable to prejudice. Maria Theresa distrusted Jews and imposed harsh measures. Joseph II's toleration policies opened opportunities but demanded assimilation. The 19th century Constitution granted equality, enabling extraordinary cultural participation. Yet anti-Semitism grew in mass politics, and after the empire fell, many Jews looked back on Franz Joseph's monarchy as a lost shield against nationalist exclusion. Franz Joseph personally received petitions from subjects across the empire. People wrote seeking pardons, pensions, jobs, permission, relief from injustice, or simple recognition. The emperor could not solve most problems, but the practice reflected a paternal model of monarchy. If local officials failed, perhaps the sovereign would hear. His work desk became an altar of bureaucratic duty. Visitors described the sparse rooms and narrow iron bed at Schönbrunn, contrasting personal simplicity with imperial grandeur. He disliked many modern comforts and maintained habits formed in youth. The emperor's discipline inspired loyalty, but it also narrowed his imagination. He could process individual cases while failing to redesign the political system. He believed compromise in 1867 had solved the Hungarian question and hesitated to reopen the structure. He regarded Franz Ferdinand's reform ideas with suspicion. Long rule created knowledge and rigidity. Every crisis survived became evidence that the same methods would work again. Elizabeth represented the opposite response to Dynasty, flight rather than routine. She escaped through travel, exercise, poetry, and identification with figures such as Achilles and Heinrich Heine. She learned Hungarian fluently and studied Greek. She disliked public display yet became one of the most photographed and mythologized women of her era. After a certain age, she hid her face behind fans or veils, refusing to let the public watch her grow older. Her beauty became frozen in youthful portraits while her actual life moved into loneliness. Rudolph's rebellion was intellectual as well as personal. He wrote anonymously for the liberal press, criticized clerical and conservative policy, and took interest in natural science. He supported the massive encyclopedic project, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy in word and picture, often called the Crown Prince's work, which described the peoples, landscapes, economies, and cultures of the realm. The project was imperial and ethnographic, celebrating diversity under the crown. Rudolph's death removed a possible reforming emperor, though no one can know whether he would have transformed the monarchy or been defeated by its contradictions. Franz Ferdinand's reputation is similarly uncertain. He disliked Hungarian elites and wanted stronger central authority or federal restructuring. He was not a liberal democrat. He could be authoritarian, prejudiced, and personally abrasive. Yet he opposed a reckless war with Serbia in earlier crises because he feared Russian intervention and the destruction of the monarchy. The man whose assassination became the excuse for war had often warned against the war his death unleashed. Emperor Karl's peace efforts also belong between myth and failure. He was more willing than German leaders to seek compromise, and he recognized the empire's desperate condition. But secret diplomacy could not overcome alliance dependence, territorial promises, and distrust. He did not publicly break with Germany when it might have mattered, and he continued to command a state at war. His admirers see a saintly alternative to militarism. His critics see a well-intentioned monarch unable to act decisively. Both views contain truth. Chance repeatedly redirected the dynasty. If Mary of Burgundy had not died in a riding accident, she might have governed longer and altered Burgundian relations. If Joanna's siblings had lived, Charles V might never have inherited Spain. If Louis II had survived Mohacs and produced an heir, the Habsburgs might not have gained Bohemia and Hungary in 1526. If Joseph I had not died of smallpox, Archduke Charles might have continued as the allied candidate for Spain. If Maria Theresa had been born male, the War of the Austrian Succession might have taken a different form. If Rudolph's driver in Sarajevo had followed the revised route, Princip might never have fired. Historical chance does not mean causes are meaningless. Accidents matter because structures make them consequential. Mary's death mattered because feudal inheritance concentrated land in individuals. Louis II's death mattered because marriage treaties prepared Habsburg claims. Charles II's infertility mattered because Europe feared dynastic concentration. Franz Ferdinand's assassination mattered because alliances, militarism, nationalism, and strategic plans had made leaders ready to gamble on war. The Habsburg story is a chain of accidents caught by institutions. The family's survival strategy often relied on having many children, yet abundance could create conflict. Sons expected appannages and offices. Territories were divided to provide for branches. Brothers challenged brothers. Albert I was murdered by a nephew over inheritance. Rudolph II and Matthias fought for control. Leopold I's sons and their descendants became central to succession wars. Maria Theresa's children carried alliances but also resentments. Dynastic unity was an ideal maintained through negotiation and hierarchy, not a natural product of blood. The House of Habsburg was also not ethnically Austrian in any simple sense. Early roots lay in present-day Switzerland and southwestern Germany. Charles V was born in Ghent, raised in the Burgundian Netherlands, and ruled Spain. Ferdinand I was born in Spain. Maria Theresa's husband came from Lorraine. Empress Zita belonged to the Bourbon-Parma family. Royal households included servants, tutors, artists, soldiers, and advisors from across Europe. The dynasty became Austrian because Vienna and the Danube lands became its durable center, not because of an unchanging national origin. This supranational identity could be inclusive at the top and unequal below. Talented nobles and officials from different regions entered imperial service. Prince Eugene was born in Paris. Metternich came from the Rhineland. Radetzky was Bohemian. Count Toff had Irish ancestry. Military and bureaucratic careers crossed local boundaries. But access depended on class, education, gender, patronage, and often language. The empire could promote a Polish aristocrat while ignoring a Polish peasant, or celebrate Croatian troops while limiting Croatian political demands. The monarchy's critics sometimes said it survived by setting peoples against one another. There is evidence for divide-and-rule tactics, especially in 1848 when the court used national conflicts to isolate revolutions. Yet national leaders also made their own choices and pursued incompatible projects. Hungarian revolutionaries sought freedom from Vienna while denying equivalent autonomy to some minorities. Italian nationalists claimed mixed territories. Czech and German activists competed over Bohemia. No imperial minister invented these conflicts from nothing. The state manipulated real divisions it had failed to reconcile. The comparison between the Habsburg and Ottoman empires is revealing. Both governed many religions and languages, combined old privileges with reform, faced nationalist movements, and were later labeled decaying empires. Both adapted more than stereotypes admit. Both built railways, bureaucracies, schools, and constitutions. Both suffered from great power intervention and war. Their border rivalry lasted centuries. But their final crises emerged from a world of nation-states and mass politics that challenged dynastic empires everywhere. The Russian Romanovs offered another mirror. Habsburgs and Romanovs cooperated against revolution and competed in the Balkans. Russia saved Franz Joseph's throne in Hungary in 1849, then felt betrayed during the Crimean War. In 1914, Russia mobilized against Austria-Hungary in the name of strategic interest and support for Serbia. By 1918, both dynasties were gone. The Romanovs were murdered by Bolsheviks. The Habsburgs went into exile. Different endings reflected different revolutions, but both showed how quickly sacred monarchy could lose coercive and emotional power. The British monarchy survived the age that destroyed Habsburg, Romanov, Hohenzollern, and Ottoman rule partly because it had become more closely integrated with parliamentary government and national identity. The Habsburg monarchy also developed parliaments and constitutional practices, but no single imperial nation embraced it. Its emperor was Austrian in one context, king of Hungary in another, and dynastic sovereign above all. That flexibility had once been an advantage. In the age of mass nationalism, it made the center difficult to define. Spain's Bourbon monarchy survived after the Habsburg line by centralizing institutions more aggressively, especially after the War of the Spanish Succession. The Nueva Planta decrees reduced the separate institutions of the Crown of Aragon. The change illustrates what the Habsburg composite system had preserved and what its successor sought to eliminate. Centralization could increase administrative unity, but it also created long memories of lost autonomy that continued to influence Spanish politics. The Netherlands followed a different path. The Dutch Republic emerged from revolt against Philip II, becoming a commercial and naval power. The southern Netherlands remained Habsburg and later became central to the history of Belgium. Thus, one Habsburg inheritance helped produce both a republic celebrated for resistance and a Catholic region shaped by continued dynastic rule. Modern borders in the Low Countries cannot be understood without the revolt against Spain and the settlement of subsequent wars. In Italy, Habsburg rule left strong traces in Lombardy, Tuscany, and other regions. Austrian administration could be reforming and efficient, yet Italian nationalists experienced it as foreign domination. The revolutions of 1848 and wars of 1859 and 1866 expelled Habsburg power from most of the peninsula. Trieste and neighboring territories remained contested until World War I. The Italian national story celebrated liberation. Local memories sometimes included appreciation for order, trade, or cosmopolitan life under the empire. History rarely gives one emotional verdict to an entire population. In the Czech lands, Habsburg rule encompassed White Mountain, Catholicization, industrial growth, national revival, and constitutional politics. Czech historical memory often condemned 3 centuries of domination, but the lands also became among the most economically advanced parts of the monarchy. Prague's architecture and institutions bear layers from imperial periods. In Hungary, the dynasty represented both suppression and the crowned partnership of 1867. Franz Joseph was the emperor who crushed the revolution and the king whose compromise enabled decades of Hungarian development. The same portrait could evoke resentment and loyalty. In Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, Galicia, Transylvania, and other regions, judgments vary just as sharply. Some communities used the imperial framework to defend themselves against neighboring national majorities. Others saw Vienna or Budapest as the obstacle to self-government. Jews often valued supranational law when nationalist movements became exclusionary. Peasants might care less about constitutional theory than taxes, land, military service, and the language of local officials. The empire contained millions of private verdicts. That is why the Habsburg story cannot end with a simple moral that empires are good or bad, diverse or doomed, civilized or oppressive. It must end with the recognition that political orders are lived differently depending on where a person stands. From a throne, the monarchy looked like inherited duty. From a noble estate, it could look like privilege. From a village under military requisition, it looked like horses taken and sons conscripted. From a Jewish family entering university, it might look like opportunity. From a nationalist classroom denied its language, it looked like humiliation. From an artist in Vienna, it looked like patrons and audiences. From an indigenous mine worker in the Spanish Americas, it looked like distant authority enforced through labor and violence. Even the dynasty's architecture carries these conflicting viewpoints. Habsburg Castle in Aargau appears modest compared with Schönbrunn or the Hofburg. Its stone walls recall a family still one among many. Schönbrunn, with its long yellow facade, formal gardens, ceremonial rooms, and hilltop gloriette, presents 18th century monarchy at the scale of a world. Visitors walk through Maria Theresa's apartments, Franz Joseph's study, and rooms associated with Napoleon's son, moving in minutes across generations that fought one another. The Hofburg contains medieval foundations, Renaissance courtyards, Baroque wings, imperial apartments, the National Library, Treasury, chapel, and modern governmental spaces. After the monarchy ended, the palace did not vanish. It changed owners and meanings. Republic moved into empire's rooms. The imperial crypt beneath the Capuchin church offers a darker map. Metal sarcophagi hold emperors, empresses, children, and relatives. Some tombs are simple, others monumental. Maria Theresa and Francis Stephen share an immense double sarcophagus decorated with scenes and symbols. Joseph too rests nearby in comparative austerity. Franz Joseph lies between Elizabeth and Rudolph, a family arrangement in death that life never achieved. The crypt transforms political history into bodies and names. Visitors who know only portraits encounter the fact that dynasties are sequences of funerals. The crown jewels offer another form of survival. The imperial crown associated with the Holy Roman Empire, the Austrian imperial crown originally made for Rudolf II, the orb, scepter, robes, and reliquaries preserve the physical theater of authority. A crown is metal and stone until a society agrees it represents law, faith, ancestry, and command. In 1918, that agreement disappeared faster than the objects did. The crown remained beautiful after it ceased to rule. The same can be said of titles. After the empire fell, the new Austrian Republic abolished noble titles. Von and hereditary ranks lost legal recognition. Members of the former dynasty became citizens under republican conditions. In Hungary, the monarchy technically continued for years without a king, governed by Regent Horthy, an admiral without a fleet in a landlocked state. The empty throne showed how institutions can persist as forms after their substance has changed. The Habsburg law became a recurring controversy in Austria because it raised questions about property, citizenship, memory, and fear of restoration. Former imperial assets had included both private family property and property connected to the sovereign institution, making confiscation legally and politically complicated. Over time, different family members renounced claims and returned. The Republic defined itself partly by refusing the dynasty and partly by inhabiting its legacy. In Spain, the Habsburg period remained central to national memory. Charles V and Philip II could be celebrated as rulers of a golden age or criticized for imperial overreach and religious repression. The Escorial stood as monastery, palace, tomb, and argument. Spanish America's independence movements in the 19th century rejected later colonial rule, but the institutions, languages, cities, churches, legal categories, and inequalities formed under Habsburg monarchs remained foundational. The dynasty's history belonged not only to Europe but to Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Philippines. Potosi offers perhaps the starkest countermonument to imperial splendor. The mountain called Cerro Rico produced silver that dazzled the world economy. Its mines consumed lives through dangerous labor and mercury exposure. Colonial authorities adapted the Andean Mita labor draft to supply workers. Silver coins traveled across oceans, financing armies and purchasing goods. One could draw a line from a miner breathing dust in the Andes to an imperial regiment marching in Flanders, from a Manila galleon to a banker in Genoa, from a Spanish court portrait to indigenous communities paying the price of empire. The Habsburg system was global before the word globalization existed. That global scale influenced the territory that became the United States. Spanish expeditions and settlements under Habsburg kings reached Florida, the Southwest, California's wider imperial context, and the Gulf. St. Augustine, founded in 1565 during Philip II's reign, became the oldest continuously inhabited European established settlement in the continental United States. Spanish missions, forts, laws, and conflicts with indigenous nations formed part of early American history. The United States did not begin only with English colonies. Habsburg Spain was present in the continent's imperial competition long before Jamestown or Plymouth. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 in present-day New Mexico occurred under Charles II's reign, when Pueblo peoples rose against Spanish colonial rule, religious suppression, and forced labor, driving colonists from the region for years. Their victory was one of the most successful indigenous uprisings against European colonization in North America. The event belongs within the Habsburg story because the distant king's authority was invoked at missions and administrative centers thousands of miles from Madrid. Empire reached farthest where the monarch was least visible. Florida became a zone of competition among Spain, indigenous nations, escaped enslaved people, and English colonies. Spanish authorities at times offered freedom to enslaved Africans who escaped from British territories and converted to Catholicism, creating communities such as Fort Mose in the later Bourbon period, but rooted in longer imperial rivalry. The boundaries between empires created openings as well as violence. People used one crown against another in pursuit of survival. The Habsburg connection to American political thought continued through memory. 18th and 19th century Americans often contrasted Republican virtue with European monarchy, using courts such as Vienna and Madrid as symbols of inherited privilege. Yet American elites collected European art, copied architecture, married into aristocratic circles, and admired imperial culture. The Republic rejected titles while developing its own rituals of power. Habsburg history became both warning and fascination. Kossuth's American tour in 1851 and 1852 dramatized that tension. Crowds hailed the Hungarian revolutionary, Congress received him, and public meetings celebrated national self-government. But the U.S. government avoided military intervention. Americans debated whether sympathy for liberty required action abroad. Kossuth's cause became entangled with domestic conflicts over slavery and union. Some abolitionists challenged Europeans who demanded freedom for their nations while ignoring enslaved people in America. The Habsburg struggle thus entered an American moral argument larger than Hungary. The Mexican Empire of Maximilian brought the dynasty still closer. During the U.S. Civil War, Washington could not easily confront French intervention, but after Appomattox the balance changed. American weapons and diplomatic pressure strengthened Juarez. Maximilian's fall reinforced the idea that European monarchies should not establish new empires in the hemisphere. Yet the story was not simply the United States defending Mexican freedom. Mexicans themselves had sustained Republican resistance. The Monroe Doctrine mattered because local struggle made French occupation costly and unstable. During World War I, the United States initially maintained diplomatic relations with Austria-Hungary even after declaring war on Germany. President Wilson's administration distinguished between the two allies for a time, hoping perhaps to separate Vienna from Berlin. The declaration of war in December 1917 acknowledged that Austria-Hungary had become part of the enemy coalition. American soldiers fought mainly against Germany on the Western Front, but U.S. diplomacy and economic power influenced the Habsburg collapse. National activists from the empire's peoples organized on American soil, translating old European claims into the language of self-determination. The Pittsburgh Agreement of 1918, signed by Czech and Slovak representatives in the United States with Masaryk, supported a common state with Slovak autonomy. South Slav immigrant groups also negotiated programs. American cities became provisional parliaments for nations not yet on the map. The irony was profound. The Habsburg monarchy's own immigrants helped dismantle it from a republic across the ocean. After collapse, U.S. relief played a role in feeding Central Europe. Herbert Hoover's relief organizations addressed hunger in countries devastated by war and blockade. The former imperial economic space had broken into states with new borders, currencies, tariffs, and transport problems. Coal might lie in one country, factories in another, food supplies in a third, and railway connections cross customs lines. Political independence arrived with economic dislocation.